One Minnesota regiment lost more soldiers in 2 minutes than most units lose in entire wars. It was July 2nd, 1863, and the Union line was collapsing. Confederate General Wilfred Barksdale had smashed through the Union center at Gettysburg, and nearly 4,000 gray-clad soldiers were pouring through the gap. General Hancock, commanding the Union position, looked around desperately for anyone who could slow the advance. That's when he spotted the 1st Minnesota Infantry, sitting in reserve with just 262 men. Hancock rode over and made a choice that would haunt both armies. He ordered Colonel William Colvill to charge directly into the Confederate column. It was suicide, but it was also the only option left. Colonel William Colvill knew what he was asking his men to do. On that July afternoon, with Confederate forces pressing hard and the Union line buckling, he made a choice that defied every rule of military logic. He ordered a direct charge into the face of a 4,000-man Confederate column, 262 soldiers against thousands. On paper, it was suicide. What happened next unfolded in brutal minutes. The Minnesotans fixed bayonets and rushed forward, screaming into the Confederate advance. Artillery tore through their ranks. Musket fire shredded their formation. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Bodies piled up on the grass. The regimental colors passed from hand to hand as color bearers were cut down one after another. When the smoke cleared just minutes later, 215 men were gone, killed, wounded, or captured. That's 82% of their entire fighting strength erased in what amounted to a handful of minutes. But here's what made it matter. They stopped the momentum. The Confederate advance, which had been rolling forward with unstoppable force, faltered and then halted. That momentary break in the enemy's push gave Union reinforcements the precious seconds they needed to arrive and reinforce the line. The 1st Minnesota didn't just die, they bought time with their blood. Now you might be wondering, did those 2 minutes actually matter? The answer is absolutely yes. It's written into the very geography of Gettysburg itself. When the 1st Minnesota charged into that Confederate column, they didn't just buy time, they bought the most critical time in American military history. The Union line on Cemetery Ridge was collapsing. Confederate General Barksdale's brigade was punching through, and if they'd succeeded, they would have seized the high ground that controlled the entire battlefield. Once you lose the high ground at Gettysburg, you lose the war. The 1st Minnesota's charge, desperate as it was, forced Barksdale's men to halt their momentum and reform. That 2-minute engagement gave Union commanders exactly what they needed, a window to wheel in fresh artillery and infantry reserves. Within minutes, reinforcements arrived and sealed the breach. The Confederate breakthrough that could have won the battle was stopped dead. Military historians have called this the single most consequential charge by a doomed unit in American warfare. It wasn't a glorious victory, it was pure mathematics. 215 casualties to prevent a battle-losing breakthrough. The 1st Minnesota didn't win Gettysburg through heroism alone. They won it by understanding that sometimes the only way to save an army is to sacrifice yourself completely. To understand what 82% actually means, you need to compare it to other military catastrophes that live in American legend. At Little Bighorn in 1876, Custer's 7th Cavalry lost roughly 268 men out of 700 combatants, about 38%. The Alamo saw 189 defenders killed out of roughly 200, which sounds worse until you do the math. That's still only 95% because the Alamo's garrison was smaller to begin with. The 1st Minnesota lost 215 soldiers from 262. That's not just higher than Little Bighorn or the Alamo proportionally, it's categorically different. They didn't get wiped out. They didn't disappear into history as a footnote about total annihilation. They survived as a unit, which makes the survival itself feel like a cruel joke. Most regiments that take 82% casualties cease to exist. They're consolidated into other units or deactivated entirely. But the 1st Minnesota kept going. They reformed. They fought through the rest of the war. That's what makes their story so haunting. They lived long enough to remember exactly what they lost. So here's what stays with us. 262 men rode into oblivion on July 2nd, and only 47 emerged unscathed. The Confederate breakthrough they stopped. History forgot it. But the 1st Minnesota, their names endure. Their desperate charge teaches us something brutal and true. Sometimes survival itself becomes the greatest victory, and sacrifice is the only language that changes wars.